The hangar smelled of oil and hot metal as the afternoon sun cut through the high, dusty windows and painted long bars of gold across the concrete floor that seemed to stretch endlessly toward the row of aircraft lined up in perfect military precision. She moved with steady hands and sharp eyes, wiping down the belt feed of the Apache's M230 chain gun. Her motions smooth and methodical, as if she had done this every day for years. The heavy weapon gleamed under her touch, and the scent of cleaning. Solvent mixed with the metallic tang of steel until the air itself felt thick enough to taste. Around her, the sound of distant tools clinking and the low hum of generators filled the vast space. Yet her focus never wavered from the task before. Her routine was a comfort in this place. It kept her mind anchored. It kept memories where they belonged, far away and locked down. She crouched slightly, adjusting the angle of the weapon to catch the last bit of sunlight streaming in, so she could see the carbon buildup along the barrel. Each stroke of the rag stripped away the black residue, revealing the cold, smooth steel beneath, and she felt a strange satisfaction in the progress. Far off at the end of the hangar came the muffled thud of boots on concrete, slow and deliberate footsteps that echoed off the walls. She kept her head down, telling herself it was nothing, probably another crew chief making rounds or a mechanic heading toward the tool bench. The footsteps drew closer, and the rhythm seemed oddly measured, like the person walking was not in a hurry but was not wandering aimlessly either. She ran the cloth along the ammunition feed link and felt the faint vibration of each metal tooth under her fingers. It was just another maintenance cycle, just another day keeping the bird in perfect working order for whoever would fly her into whatever came next. The steps grew louder until they blended with the faint hum of the overhead lights and the occasional metallic clink from somewhere deep in the shadows. She did not look up. Her hands moved with practiced precision as she inserted the cleaning rod into the barrel, twisting it slowly and pulling it out to check the residue. The air shifted behind her in that subtle way that told her someone had stopped only a few feet away. The faint reflection of a visor caught in the polished steel of the gun barrel made her pause ever so slightly, but she forced herself to keep moving, the shadow over. Her shoulder was unmistakable now, blocking the sunbeam that had been warming the side of her face a moment ago. The figure stood silently, and she could feel the weight of their presence even without turning around. She told herself it was nothing, told herself to finish the job and not think about it. But the tiny hairs on the back of her neck rose anyway. She wiped down the final section of the feed and set the cloth aside, reaching for another tool from the open kit beside her. The boots shifted slightly, a scuff against the concrete, as if the person was adjusting their stance to get a better look at her, or at the weapon, or maybe both. For a second, she considered breaking the silence with a casual remark, something about the weather, or the schedule. But something in the stillness behind her made her hold her tongue. There was a tension in the air now, like a wire pulled tight between them, a pressure that did not belong in the comfort of routine maintenance. She reached up to check the mounting bolts, running her fingers along the cold metal, feeling for any looseness. The visor's faint reflection moved slightly as the figure tilted their head, and though she could not see their eyes, she could sense the scrutiny in that gesture. The moment stretched far longer than it should have, and she wondered if the footsteps had been approaching her specifically, or if this was some coincidence she could ignore. Then, without warning, the shadow leaned closer, just enough for the faint scent of jet fuel and sweat to reach her, and in that instant she knew this was not just another routine day. The Apache's machine gun sat gleaming in the sunlight between them, a silent witness to whatever was about to happen next. And she could feel the beat of her pulse in her ears as she finally realized she had no idea who was standing behind her, or why they had stopped so close without saying a word. The pilot's gloved hand rested on the dark green fuselage just above the maintenance panel, his fingers tapping lightly in a slow rhythm that felt less like idle habit and more like a signal of thought, as if he was piecing something together. In his mind, he stood there for a long moment, not speaking, not moving beyond that faint tapping, and she could feel the air between them grow heavier, as though the space in the hangar had shrunk to just the two of them and the gun. Her eyes stayed on the weapon, refusing to turn toward him, because some instinct told her that meeting his gaze would be the start of something she could not take back. Then, without warning, his head shifted and his visor angled slightly toward her arm, and she knew exactly what had caught his attention. The patch was small, worn and frayed at the edges, its black fabric dulled with age, but the silver stitching of the emblem still gleamed faintly in the dim light. It had been sewn onto her sleeve for years, almost forgotten by most who noticed it because they never knew what it meant. But the way he froze made her certain that this pilot knew. His visor tilted again, the light bouncing off it in a brief flash before settling into stillness, his silence, louder than any question he could have asked. She kept moving her hands over the weapon's feed tray, brushing away the last traces of carbon, but her pulse was beginning to pound against her ribs in a way that was impossible to ignore. Finally, his voice came low and measured. "Where did you get that?" No preamble, no introduction. Just the question dropped between them like a weight. She felt her grip on the rag tighten until the fabric twisted in her palm. For a moment she considered answering, with the same easy lie she had used before when someone had asked about it in passing. But she knew from his tone that this would not be one of those times. He did not sound curious in the way strangers did. He sounded like a man who already knew part of the answer and was waiting for her to confirm the rest. She could hear the faint whine of a turbine spooling up somewhere outside the hangar, but in here it was just his voice hanging in the still air. She said nothing, running the cloth over the gun barrel in deliberate slow strokes as if ignoring him might make him lose interest. It did not work. The sound of his gloves brushing against the metal frame as he adjusted his stance came next, and then the question again this time, quieter but sharper. "Where did you get that?" The words slid under her guard like a blade. Every instinct told her to keep her mouth shut, but the way he said it made it clear he was not guessing. He was remembering. Her mind flashed back to the night. She first wore that patch. The chaos, the shouting, the crack of gunfire in the distance, and the cold wind that cut through her as she moved from shadow to shadow. She had thought she had left all of that far behind. Now she was not so sure. The pilot's posture remained still, but there was an intensity radiating from him that made her wonder if he had already decided what her answer would be. She kept her breathing, even kept her gaze fixed on the dark metal in front of her, but inside every part of her was braced like she was back in a place where danger could come from any direction without warning. In the reflection of the gun barrel, she could see just enough of him to know he was not going anywhere. She realized with a sinking certainty that no matter what she said next, the quiet balance of her life here was already beginning to crack, and the worst part was that he seemed to know it too. She froze with the cloth still pressed against the side of the gun, the faint smell of oil drifting upward as if the weapon itself was holding its breath along with her. The patch had been part of her life for so long that she had almost stopped noticing it, but now it felt heavy on her arm, like it carried the weight of every choice she had made since that night. Her fingers twitched slightly over the smooth metal as her mind fought to decide whether to lie or to speak the truth, and either way she knew the cost would be high. The pilot stood unmoving, but the silence between them was alive, filled with questions and unspoken recognition that pressed against her like the heat of a spotlight. His visor reflected the thin beam of sunlight, spilling from the high windows, making it impossible for her to see his eyes. Yet she could feel them cutting straight into her. Her pulse drummed steadily in her ears, drowning out the faint background noise of the hangar, the distant whir of a ventilation fan, the muffled clang of tools somewhere far away. She thought of the day she had earned the patch, the weight of the dust in the air, the sound of boots pounding across hard ground, the shouts and the static from radios blending into one endless rush of noise. The memory was so clear it might as well have been happening again, and with it came the face of the man who had pressed the patch into her palm, saying nothing, only giving her a brief nod before disappearing into the smoke. She had told herself she would never explain that moment to anyone, that it was hers alone, and the fewer people who knew, the better. And yet here was this pilot asking the one question she could not brush off with a joke or a shrug. She slid the cleaning rod into the barrel, feeling the slight resistance of the rifling before pulling it back out slowly, inspecting it for residue. Her hands moved on instinct, her body clinging to the safety of routine, while her mind raced through possible answers. The pilot did not shift his stance, did not clear his throat, did not make a single move that might break the moment. She realized he was patient, and that patience made him more dangerous than someone who would push her for an immediate answer. Her breathing slowed as she tried to measure his intent, but the visor gave nothing away and the stillness felt heavier with each passing second. She wanted to ask why he cared, why it mattered to him now, but she was afraid of what his answer might reveal. The patch had always been a quiet part of her story, something she carried like a scar, visible only to those who knew where to look. Now it was exposed in the worst possible way. Her eyes flicked briefly to the open hangar doors, where the sunlit air shimmered in the heat outside, and for a fleeting moment she thought about walking away, just leaving the gun half cleaned and stepping into the light. But she knew that would not work. He would follow her. He would keep asking. And in the end, he would get his answer one way or another. The rag in her hand felt damp with oil and sweat as she set it down slowly, her mind still searching for a path that would let her keep the past where it belonged. She could hear the faint creak of his gloves as he adjusted his grip on the fuselage, and somehow that tiny sound carried more weight than the roar of any engine. The truth balanced on the edge of her thoughts, ready to spill if she let her guard slip even for a second. And she was, starting to wonder if maybe he already knew it and was only waiting for her to confirm. The sound of a distant helicopter spinning up outside rolled faintly into the hangar, the rhythmic chop of its blades still slow, but building steadily like the pulse of a warning. It filled the empty spaces between them, but did nothing to ease the weight of his stare, and she could feel that weight even though she had yet to meet his eyes. She told herself to keep calm, to keep her voice steady, as she said it was just a gift from a friend. The words sounded almost casual in her own ears, but she knew they would not land that way for him. He did not move, and his silence pressed in harder, as if it were something solid. "That patch does not get given as a gift," he said finally, and the certainty in his voice made her stomach knot. The truth of it was undeniable, and the air around her felt colder, as though the hangar itself had shifted into a different place. Only one unit carried that emblem, and most of the people who wore it never came back, and she had seen that herself more than once. She did not need to look at him to know he understood exactly what it meant. Her hands resumed their work, almost automatically moving along the sleek metal as if clinging to the task might hold off what was coming. The scrape of the rag over the feed tray was steady, almost soothing, but the sound of his boots on the concrete as he took a single step closer shattered that rhythm. "You know I am right," he said, and it was not a question. Her throat felt dry and she forced herself to swallow before answering. But no words came. Outside, the helicopter's rotors had reached a deeper pitch, the steady whump, whump, whump growing louder as if echoing the pounding of her heart. She thought about the first time she had seen that patch, on someone else about how it had meant danger and loyalty and sacrifice all bound together in a way most people would never understand. She thought about the night she had earned hers when the air had been thick with smoke and dust, and she had moved without thinking, just acting because there was no other choice. She thought about the faces that had not made it out, and how each one had been burned into her memory along with the emblem that tied them together. The pilot's voice cut through, her thoughts low but sharp like a blade sliding through cloth. "You were there, were you not?" She still did not answer, but the faint tremor in her fingers as she adjusted the weapon's elevation probably gave him more than she wanted to admit. The whine of an electric cart passing outside the hangar drifted in briefly and then faded, leaving only the thrum of the helicopter and the sound of their breathing. She knew that every second she kept silent, he was pulling the pieces together in, his mind connecting what he knew from his past to the woman standing in front of him now. And once he had all the pieces, there would be no way to take them back. The rag in her hand felt heavier now, the cloth darkened with oil and residue. But she kept moving it over the barrel, because it was the only thing she could control in that moment. He shifted his weight slightly, the faint squeak of his boots on the polished floor making her glance up for just a heartbeat. It was enough to see the way his visor was fixed directly on her arm, the black patch with its fraying silver edges seeming almost brighter in the dim light. Her breath caught, but she forced her eyes back down to the weapon. The helicopter's roar was louder now, vibrating faintly through the concrete under her boots. And she had the strange thought that if she did not answer him soon, they might both be pulled into something neither of them had planned for. And deep down, she knew that whatever came next would change. Everything. The pilot pulled off his gloves slowly and deliberately, as if each finger of leather released from his hand was marking time in some unspoken countdown. The skin beneath was marked by pale ridges and uneven patches, the kind of scars that did not come from accidents in a workshop, but from fire and heat, and moments where survival had been decided in seconds. He let the gloves hang loosely from one hand and stepped forward until the faint smell of aviation fuel and dust from his flight suit drifted toward her. His voice was quieter now, but carried the kind of weight that made every word feel intentional. "I saw that patch once before on someone who saved my life." Her pulse kicked hard against her ribs, but she kept her gaze locked on, the metal in front of her running the cloth along the receiver as if nothing had been said. The edges of the rag were dark with oil and grime, but she gripped it tighter as if holding on to it could anchor her in place. She heard him shift his stance, the sound of his boots faint against the concrete, yet each movement seemed amplified in the stillness. It was not just curiosity in his tone. Now there was something else in it, something like recognition, tangled with a thread of disbelief. She told herself to breathe slowly to keep her expression neutral to avoid giving him the confirmation he seemed to be searching for. But he did not look away. His visor still angled perfectly toward her face, and then to the patch, and then back again. The hum of the hangar lights overhead seemed louder than usual, a steady low vibration that filled the silence between them. Her mind flicked back unbidden to a night filled with dust and the roar of engines, the sky streaked with flashes of light, the air thick with the kind of heat that made your lungs ache. She had been moving fast that night, dragging someone heavier than herself across rough ground, every muscle burning, every instinct screaming to keep going, because stopping was not an option. She remembered the moment she had pulled him behind the wrecked vehicle, the burst of gunfire overhead, the sound of his breathing ragged but alive. She had never looked back to see his face. She had only seen the glint of his helmet as she turned, to face what was coming next. Now she wondered if the man in front of her was the same man from that night. His voice broke into her thoughts again, low and insistent. "You do not have to tell me everything. But I need to know if it was you." Her hands, stilled just for a second, before she forced them back into motion, wiping the same section of the gun twice, even though it was already spotless. She thought about lying about making up a story that would shut him down, but she knew deep down it would not work. Some people could be pushed away with half-truths, but not this one. Outside the helicopter's rotors thundered into a steady beat vibrating faintly through the hangar floor, each pulse matching the rhythm of her heartbeat. The pilot waited, not pressing her, not filling the silence with more questions, just letting the weight of the moment do the work for him. She glanced briefly at the open toolkit beside her, considering whether to busy herself with another task. Something that would let her turn away from him without it looking like she was retreating. But she stayed where she was, the rag warm in her hand from the heat of the weapon and her own grip. His scars caught the light, and for the first time she noticed how they seemed to map out a history of pain and survival, each line and mark telling its own silent story. It made her wonder how much of that history she had been a part of without even realizing it. The air between them felt tighter now, as if the walls of the hangar had drawn closer without either of them moving, and she knew that whatever she said next would not just answer his question, it would open a door she had worked for years to keep locked. She thought about turning away, thought about pretending she had somewhere else to be, thought about gathering her tools and walking to the far end of the hangar where the noise of the other crews would swallow up his voice. But she knew the moment she made that move he would follow, and the questions would follow too, and she was not sure she had the strength to keep holding the answers back. The pilot leaned one shoulder against the frame of the Apache, and it looked like a natural place for him to be. Like the machine knew him, like the cold armor of the aircraft had been built around men like him who had flown through fire and come back when they should not have. He told her a story in the same steady voice as before, his words, slow enough that each one landed like a small impact. He said there had been a valley long ago, narrow and steep-walled, the kind of place where everything was funneled into tight lines of fire, and the enemy knew it. He said his unit had been pinned. Down the radio calls breaking into static, the sound of rounds striking stone around them. The air thick with dust from explosions, and the heat of the sun above turning the whole place into a trap. He said it had been minutes away from ending badly, when a figure came through the chaos wearing that same black patch with the silver emblem, and the moment he saw it he knew they were not just another soldier, they were something else entirely. The figure had moved fast, precise, cutting through the line with impossible accuracy, pulling the wounded back under cover without hesitation. And just as suddenly as they had appeared, they were gone, swallowed up into the dust and smoke before anyone could even ask their name. He said he had carried that image with him for years. The patch burned into his mind more than the face, because he had never seen it clearly. Now here he was, years later, staring at that same emblem again, and the way he said it left no room for doubt that he believed. The person who had saved him was standing right in front of him. She kept her hands moving on the weapon, because if she stopped moving, she felt like the weight of the moment might crush her. She knew that valley. She could still smell the burned powder and hear the crack of rounds striking so close that the sound rattled in her bones. She could still feel the drag of a man's weight over her shoulder, the ache in her legs as she forced herself forward. She had never thought she would see anyone from that day again. And for a moment, she wondered if fate had a cruel sense of humor. The rotors outside were louder now, their deep rhythm sending faint tremors up through her boots and into her legs. The pilot's visor tilted slightly, as if he was studying the way her hands moved, the way her shoulders shifted, the way she avoided his gaze. It was the kind of observation you could not hide from someone who had learned to read the smallest signs in the heat of battle. She considered telling him he was wrong, telling him the patch was nothing more than a piece of fabric she had found years ago, telling him it had no story, but the words refused to come because they would taste like a lie, even to her own ears. Instead, she ran, her fingers along the last section of the barrel checking for rough spots. she knew were not there. The air in the hangar felt still and heavy, despite the open doors, as if everything inside had paused, waiting for her to say something to break the moment. He did not move closer. He did not raise his voice. He just stayed there, a fixed presence impossible to ignore, and she could feel that he would wait for hours if that was what it took. And she realized with a slow, creeping certainty that the silence between them was not going to end on its own, and that the next word spoken would change the course of the day, and maybe far more than that. Her hands trembled just enough that she tightened her grip on the rag to hide it twisting the fabric until the edges dug into her palm and the faint grit of oil and carbon pressed into her skin. The memory of that valley was no longer a shadow. At the edge of her thoughts, it was here in the hangar with her, as real as the Apache in front of her, as sharp as the cold air seeping through the open doors. She could hear the shouts again, the chaotic mix of commands and warnings blending with the staccato rhythm of gunfire. She could see the arcs of tracer rounds burning through the dusty haze, the ground shaking beneath each detonation. She had been there not as a name on a roster, but as someone who moved where she was needed dragging. A man from open ground to cover, feeling every pound of his weight, as if it were welded to her own body. In the blur of that day, she had not looked back. She had not tried to remember faces, only actions, and the certainty that stopping would mean death for them both. Now, as she glanced at the pilot, she wondered if the man she had saved had been wearing the same helmet, the same visor, and if beneath that visor had been the same eyes now fixed on her with unshakable focus. The thought sent a strange ripple through her chest, a mix of unease and something she could not name, something that felt too close to recognition. The rotors outside beat against the air in a steady, relentless rhythm, their vibrations traveling up through the concrete. Into her boots, a reminder that the present was still moving forward even as the past wrapped itself tighter around her. The pilot spoke again, and his voice was not sharp this time, but almost quiet enough to be drowned out by the aircraft outside. "You remember it too, do you not?" She kept her eyes on the weapon and said nothing, but the pause in her movements was all the answer he needed. His head tilted slightly, the light catching on the visor making it impossible to see his expression. But the way he held himself told her he had already reached his conclusion. Her heartbeat quickened, and she forced herself to move again, checking the same bolt twice more than necessary, just to keep her hands busy. The smell of aviation fuel mixed with the faint metallic tang from the cleaned gun, and it pulled her further back into that other place. That other time when the air had been thick with the scent of burning, and the ground littered with debris from moments that could not be undone. She wondered if he had carried the memory of that day the same way she had, if he had replayed it in the quiet moments when sleep refused to come, if he had ever wondered who had stepped out of the smoke to pull him from the edge. And now he was, standing here looking at her like he had finally found the answer to a question he had never stopped asking. The space between them felt smaller now, though neither of them had moved, the weight of their unspoken understanding pressing in on all sides. For a brief second, she imagined what it would be like to tell him the truth, to admit that yes, she had been there, and yes, she had seen him fall, and yes, she had refused to leave him behind. But then she imagined what would follow: the questions, the connections, the attention she had spent years avoiding, and the danger that could come from someone knowing too much about where she had been and what she had done. She could not let that door open. Not now. Maybe not ever. Her grip on the rag tightened again, and she felt the oil seep into her skin, but she did not loosen it. Outside, the rotor wash sent a gust of air through the hangar, lifting the loose edges of paper on a nearby bench and carrying with it the faint scent of the open sky. It made her want to move, to escape, to step into that wind and let it carry her away from the weight of the moment. But she stood rooted in place, because leaving now would only confirm everything he suspected. The pilot's voice came once more, low enough that she almost had to strain to hear it. "You can pretend all you want, but I know it was you." And the truth in his tone hit her harder than any accusation could have. The pilot's words hung in the air between them, heavier than the smell of fuel and the tang of metal and the steady thrum of the rotors outside, and she felt them settle into her chest like something she could not shake off. He had said it like a fact, not a suspicion, and the certainty in his voice left no room for her to sidestep it. No room for the comfort of pretending he might be mistaken. Her breath slowed without her meaning to control it. Each inhale deliberate, each exhale careful, as if the way she breathed might betray more than her words ever could. The hangar felt smaller somehow, the distance to the far wall shrinking the space between her and the open doors closing in the Apache beside her, a silent sentinel to a truth she had tried for years to bury under the weight of new routines. He took one step closer, his boots making no more than a whisper against the concrete. But she felt the sound as much as she heard it. The kind of sound you remembered in your bones. "You were there, weren't you?" he said. And though his tone was calm, it was not the calm of a man guessing. It was the calm of someone stating what they already knew. Her grip on the rag loosened slightly, her fingers aching from how tightly she had been. Holding it, and the smell of the oil on the cloth rose stronger for a moment. She could hear her own pulse in her ears, the sound almost drowning out the low murmur of voices from the far side of the hangar, where another crew worked on a different aircraft. She wanted to answer with a denial, but the words caught somewhere between her chest and her throat, as if her body had decided for her that the lie would not pass. Instead, she stayed silent. And in that silence the pilot seemed to find all the confirmation he needed. He stepped again, closer now, close enough that she could see faint scratches on the curve of his visor marks that told their own stories of impacts and close calls. The air between them seemed to thicken with something, unspoken something that had been building since the moment his eyes had locked on the patch. She felt the weight of years pressing on her shoulders, the long shadow of decisions made in seconds but remembered for a lifetime. The hangar smelled of hot metal and machine grease, and underneath it all she could still smell the dust of that valley and the sharp, acrid burn of gunpowder in the air. Her mind was caught between then and now, between the moment she had grabbed that man by his vest and pulled with everything she had, and the moment here where the man in front of her might be that same person, standing alive and breathing and waiting for her to speak. She thought about the people who had been there that day, the ones who had not walked away, the ones whose stories ended in the shadows of those cliffs. She thought about how the patch had been handed to her after it was over, a silent gesture that carried more weight than any medal could have. And she thought about how she had sewn it onto her sleeve without ever meaning for anyone to notice. The wind from outside pushed through the open hangar doors again, carrying with it the scent of jet exhaust and distant desert heat, and it made her wonder if the world beyond those doors was about to pull her back into something she had tried to leave behind. His visor tilted just enough that she knew his eyes were on hers, even if she could not see them, and for a moment it felt like the rest of the hangar had gone. Silent, like the other crews had stopped moving, like the aircraft outside had frozen in place. "Say it," he said, and the two words felt heavier than any order she had ever heard. She opened her mouth, and the air seemed to still around her as if the hangar itself was waiting to hear her answer. Her lips parted, and for a heartbeat nothing came out, as if her voice had been left somewhere far away in another time. Another place where the dust and the noise had swallowed everything whole, and now she was here with the pilot staring at her, waiting for the words that could not be taken back. "I was there," she finally said, and the sound of it was quieter than she expected, almost lost under the hum of machinery, but it carried between them like a signal flare in the night. The pilot stood, still not moving, not reacting for a moment, his visor catching a sliver of the overhead light, and she saw his fingers curl slightly against his thigh as if he was holding something back. "You saved me," he said, not asking it but stating it with the same certainty he had carried since first seeing the patch on her sleeve, and the truth in his voice cut through her like a blade and mended something in the same instant. She shook her head, not in denial, but in the way someone does when they cannot bear to take credit for something they know came at too high a cost, and the memory rushed in before she could stop it. The noise of the Apache overhead that day, the ground shuddering with each shot, the shouts in her ear, the burning sting in her lungs as she ran through the dust and smoke, and the sight of him down in the dirt barely moving. She had reached him, pulling at his vest, feeling the weight of him, the dead weight that scared you because it meant you might be too late, and then the sound of rounds hitting close enough to make her teeth ache. She had dragged him to cover, not thinking, not counting the seconds, only moving until someone else took him from her hands and yelled for the medic, and she had turned back, without waiting to see if he lived because the fight was still going. Now here he was, breathing, standing, staring at her like he could not reconcile the face in front of him with the shadow of a figure that had appeared through the haze of battle years. Ego. You should have said something, he told her, and she felt the faintest edge of accusation in it, but not unkind. Only the ache of a man who wished he had known sooner. It would not have changed anything, she said. And in her chest, she knew it was true, though she also knew it might have changed everything in ways she could not predict. Outside the hangar, the light was shifting the day, moving toward evening, the shadows of the helicopters stretching longer across the concrete, as if even the machines were listening to this exchange. The pilot took another step closer until there was no more space for shadows between them, and he reached up slowly, removing his helmet with a motion so deliberate it felt ceremonial. His face was older than she remembered from that day, lined from years of flying and the kind of missions that etched themselves into you. But his eyes were the same, and in them she saw the moment he had recognized her from the movement of her hands, the way she handled the weapon, the quiet certainty of her stance. "I thought you were gone," he said, and she could hear in his voice the weight he had carried all this time, the burden of a debt unpaid to a ghost he thought he would never find. She wanted to tell him there was no debt, that it was just what you did for the people beside you, but the words would not come. Instead, she held his gaze and let the silence between them carry the meaning. From across the hangar, someone called for him, his name echoing against the steel walls, and he looked over his shoulder, then back at her as if afraid she might vanish if he turned away for too long. "This is not over," he told her, his voice low and certain, and she knew he meant more than just the conversation. She nodded once, not in agreement or refusal, but as someone who understood that some things could not be closed neatly with words. The call came again, sharper this time, and he stepped back, still watching her, as if memorizing her in case she disappeared, again into the routine of cleaning machines and fading into the background. Then he turned and walked toward the open hangar doors, the light catching the patch on his own sleeve, and for a moment she thought she saw him hesitate, as if already planning. When he would return, she watched him go, the sound of his boots against the floor fading into the hum of the hangar, and she knew that whatever came next, the past she had kept buried was now walking toward her again, step by step.